My name is Dennis Cooley. I am the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute. And thank you for going through all of these hurdles to be here today. We're going to be, and I've lost my my thing. What we're going to talk about today is free will and determinism. And Scott, I don't know how to say your last name. Forschler?
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. I got that. He's going to be talking about this on Wednesday, the 24th at noon. I know I'm moving the science, religion, lunch thing around a bit. We will have another speaker on race and systematic racism. So if you're interested in that, that we can send that out. It's the title of the talk, Attending to Racial Violence and Anti-Racism. University of Kansas professor Ju Oak Kim will be presenting that. And so I'm going to turn this over to Scott.
So I'm going to talk about determinism and free will. I think this is the third or fourth time I've talked here, so I'm glad we're able to make this by Zoom. I just want to mention that I took the opportunity in the COVID crisis to move to Hawaii. We're still settling in, but if you hear a rooster or loud rain, that's the environment we're in. Otherwise, it's paradise, but that's what I'm dealing with. And it's 8 o'clock here, but I'm awake, so here we go. So I'm going to talk about determinism and free will today. My main interest, as some of you may know, is in ethical theory, but that has led me into questions about what it means to be an agent or to be responsible. And that leads for some people to questions about how that can be compatible in a possibly deterministic world. So jump right into it. Here's my talk outline. I'm going to rush through some parts because this really is a talk that could go on for an hour and a half if I covered every single question on it. But I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of free will and different positions people take on them, lay out some terminology. Then I'll go into detail on those 3 types of free will and how I think they are related to each other. Then I will address one objection, which was classically made by Immanuel Kant, a famous German philosopher. And I'm going to show how his particular example actually turns out not to be an objection, but you can turn it around to support the view that I'm going to promote. And so that we have 2 questions now to consider. One is the world determined? That is, given the past state of the universe, is there only one way things could happen in the immediate or for the eternal future from there on? This is a scientific question. Different scientific theories have different views on it. Quantum physics is kind of either way depending upon how you interpret it, but I'm not going to get into any of that because that's really not important. The question is if the world is deterministic, how does that relate to free will? And that's the second question, and that's a philosophical question. And how we answer that question depends upon a third question, and that is, what exactly is free will? What do we mean when we say freedom of the will? And here I'm going to give some fairly standard things that any other philosopher could give, although at the end I'm going to give an example that is unique to me that may shed some light on this. But it's generally agreed that there are at least three different types of free will or aspects of free will or things that we're talking about when we talk about free will. The first I'll call contra-causal freedom, CC sub F. This is the claim that our choices can be contra-causal. They are not fixed by and perhaps can even go against causal forces in space-time that we might otherwise think would influence them. So just take a toy example. I go to an ice cream store. I can choose vanilla or chocolate. I choose chocolate. So we can put this 2 different ways. Some people say, suppose God rewound the tape of the universe, went back in time, reset the universe to the point where I'm walking up to the ice cream shop and lets it play again, lets things once again happen freely, as free as they can be, as free as they ordinarily are. Do I necessarily choose chocolate? Even if he does that 100 times in a row, do I choose chocolate every time? Or do I sometimes choose vanilla when we replay the tape of time? Or if you don't like that example, and I don't really for various reasons, we can also imagine, suppose there's a planet called Earth 2, which is a quadrillion light years away. And through some bizarre coincidence, it's exactly like Earth 1, the one we live on. All the atoms are the same. They're in the same relationship to each other. There's a Scott 2 on Scott Earth. He's walking up to ice cream shop 2. Everything in the past causal experience and interactions of Scott 2 with the universe is exactly as it is for Scott 1. Scott 1 on Earth 1 chose chocolate. Does Scott 2 on Earth 2 also necessarily choose chocolate, or is it possible that he could choose vanilla? So that's contra-causal freedom. Took a little bit of time to explain. The other two, more briefly, responsibility freedom is that we are responsible for our choices, and more so, not necessarily exclusively so, but more so than any other causal influences that might have affected our choice. And then teleological freedom is our capacity to choose to respond to teleological reasons when we choose. And these are reasons that are directed towards future ends or goals. Telos is just a Greek word for an end or a goal, something you're aiming at. These goals could be purely instrumental, like I open an umbrella to stay dry during the rain. It could be moral. I help somebody because I perceive some need that they have. It could be epistemic. I investigate the world to acquire some knowledge. But whatever they are, they're directed towards some future goal that I'm trying to achieve. Now, here's some definitions of positions people take here that are common answers to question 2, which again is determinism compatible with free will? There's 2 camps, aptly named, you think, except I'm going to argue that they aren't. The first is compatibilism. The second is incompatibilism. Not surprisingly, compatibilists say that determinism is compatible with free will. Incompatibilists say it is not. Now, there are 2 important subvarieties of incompatibilism. The first is libertarianism. This has nothing to do with political libertarianism, so just put that out of your mind. Libertarianism with respect to free will is the claim that free will exists, and since it's incompatible with determinism, determinism is false. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is true, and therefore free will does not exist. Okay, so those are the 3 main camps you've got: compatibilism, and then libertarian incompatibilism, and hard determinist incompatibilism. Now, it sure sounds like, from what I've said, that compatibilism and incompatibilism disagree on something really important. One thinks something is true that the other thinks is false. But actually, that's misleading, because each one means free will in a different sense. And this returns to the definitions or the aspects of free will that I discussed on the previous slide. Here's the positions they take on that. Compatibilism, and I do have some footnotes here if you want a quick write down, if you want to follow up any of these books. These are some major recent books on free will and determinism. So compatibilism is the view that free will is equal to, or at least is most essentially identified with, teleological freedom and or responsibility freedom. And compatibilists go to great lengths to argue that both of these are compatible with determinism, especially the first, but often they say both. Incompatibilists say that free will is either identical with contra-causal freedom, or at least it essentially involves it. Sometimes they say it's the conjunction of all 3 of these types of freedom. And that's what free will really is. And then they argue that this is incompatible with determinism. Okay. Now, I've underlined the second part of each of their claims because it's not hard to see, well, or at least I will argue, that both of them are correct about the underlined claims. This is especially true for incompatibilism. You hardly need to argue for it. Just look at the definition of contra-causal free will, and it's straightforwardly obvious that it is incompatible with determinism. That the other 2 types of freedom are compatible with determinism, that I'm going to argue in the next couple of slides here. Okay, so the real disagreement between compatibilists and incompatibilists is not about how the world works. One little caveat, that's not true for libertarians. Libertarians do disagree about how the world works. I think they're wacko, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But there is but the hard determinists and the compatibilists, they essentially agree about the facts. And Richard Dawkins, in one of his books, has a nice phrase, found phrase that captures this. He came across 2 biologists arguing in a hall in a conference, and they were debating about how to classify species. The exact thing doesn't matter, but they were arguing, and then finally one of them said, look, we actually agree about this. It's just that you say it wrong. And that's really what the disagreement between compatibilists and hard determinists, at least, is about. They agree on all the facts about how science works and what's compatible, what they just want to say it different ways. So there's a disagreement, but it's really more terminological than substantive. Okay, now, given all this, why would anyone think that free will is, or at least necessarily includes, contra-causal freedom? We need to address this squarely. When you read the libertarians, they will often spend hundreds of pages arguing for contra-causal freedom, but usually at some crucial point, beginning or end or somewhere in the middle, they will say the reason contra-causal freedom is so important is that without it, you can't have responsibility freedom or teleological freedom. Those are the real things we want to believe that we have, that we are committed to us having. So we better argue for contra-causal freedom because that's the only way to get that. Okay. Now, a second argument for it is that some people think that our pre-theoretical intuitions, that is, if you just ask the man on the street, the man on the Clapham omnibus, as they say in Britain, do we have free will and what does that mean? The argument is that this will usually be described in ways that involves contra-causal freedom. Okay. Compatibilists disagree with both of these points. They argue that not only are responsibility and teleological freedom not only do they not require contra-causal freedom, but contra-causal freedom would actually be inconsistent with those two things. So if you believe that we are responsible and believe that we can act on teleological reasons, then you'd better not believe in contra-causal freedom. And the idea that these are connected is a deep philosophical mistake. They also point out that whatever intuitions we think we have that support contra-causal freedom directly are often abandoned when we consider specific cases and distinguish certain aspects of free will from each other. So I'm going to address some of these concerns on the next few pages. First, does responsibility freedom require contra-causal freedom? No. It might seem that this is the case if we imagine ourselves, the choosing agents, as being something outside of the causal chain of events, including all the things that influence our psychology, and including all the things that are going on in our brains. And we imagine, yeah, but that's not me. I'm some other thing which exists outside of time and space. It might also seem that you need this, not so much that to make us wholly responsible, but for God to not be responsible for our choices. So there's a religious aspect here. If you believe that there's an omnipotent and omniscient God who set up the universe, put us in it, made us the way we are, then even if we are also somewhat responsible, God would be responsible for our choices if what we choose is an inevitable deterministic consequence of the initial conditions that God was fully responsible for setting up. So if you then throw in contra-causal freedom and say, yeah, but somehow we have this magical power to act against the causal stream, then God's off the hook. He could have set up all the initial conditions and he's still not responsible for what we do, only we are. So these are some of the motivations behind believing in contra-causal freedom. The problem with this is if you are a libertarian and you believe in contra-causal freedom, the agent vanishes. It can no longer be detected. It can't even meaningfully be talked about because an uncaused self outside of space-time can only manifest itself in the space-time experience we have as a random event that occurs from, or a series of random events that appear from nowhere. And the claim that this source of it, this self, even exists, let alone causes things, is neither meaningful or testable. If you go back to, say, John Stuart Mill's analysis of several ways to detect whether A is a cause of B or not, you can't use any of those methods. We have no way of accessing this non-causal self that just pops in to do things once in a while. So the claim that it does things is meaningless. Now, libertarians have a response to this. They say that that's looking at it all from the third person perspective. What we should really do is appeal to our first personal experience of choice. The problem is that I don't think, at least my first personal experience of choice supports their view, and I don't think anyone else's will either if you really think about what your first personal experience is. For one thing, our experience identifies events going on in my body as my actions only if they are properly correlated with, that is, caused by certain past and ongoing events or states, such as most particularly my desires, my values, my intentions, my ongoing psychological dispositions. There are things going on in our bodies that are not so correlated. My digestion, hiccups, dizzy spells, things like that. So if we don't have a grip on how to test when something is caused by some prior things like my desires, and when it isn't, then we don't have a way to identify when something is really my choice and when it's just something happening to or in me. In other words, if an act was contra-causally free, as the libertarians claim it is, it would not be the act of a will, let alone my will. It might be somebody else's will, but it really just would be this random thing coming in from nowhere. So if we had contra-causal freedom, well, it wouldn't be our freedom. It wouldn't be us doing things. And therefore, it would not lead to a judgment that we are responsible for our choices. I'm going to skip that slide and go on to teleological freedom. Does this require contra-causal freedom? No, again, I'm going to say a little bit more about this because this is kind of closer to my specialty. It might think, again, that it might seem that contra-causal freedom is required for teleological freedom if we thought that pursuing a future goal cannot be explained by past causes and involves choices caused by a future goal instead of by the past. But there is a straightforward explanation for how goal-directed behavior is compatible with a completely causally deterministic universe, because it's not caused. Let's say I open the umbrella. I see it's raining outside. I want to stay dry. I open the umbrella. My opening the umbrella is not caused by any future state. It's not caused by the fact that I'm going to stay dry in the future. Indeed, I might not stay dry. Someone might take my umbrella away from me. It might fall, and then I stay wet. So it's not the future state reaching back into the past to cause it. Rather, my opening the umbrella is caused by some past events, most particularly and prominently by my present representation of what states I want to be in the future. The representation is about the future, but the representation itself is in the present and immediate past. Now, this kind of causation, teleological causation, is indeed very special. It's a very unique and strange, even subset of all the other sorts of non-teleological causation going on in the universe. So it is different, but that doesn't make it non-causal. Most non-human beings, rocks, billiard balls, even carrots, follow very simple laws of passive mechanical response. We can predict with a few simple laws what they're going to do. You push a pool ball, it rolls in the direction it's pushed. You push a human, they might push back. They're going to react in some more complicated way because they have goals which the billiard ball does not. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that we are sensitive to patterns in the world that other items, rocks and billiard balls, are not. We are sensitive to patterns that either are affordances to or obstacles to our ends. And again, our ends are just representations of what we want to happen in the future to ourselves or to our environment. How do we get those representational patterns? How are we sensitive to them? Well, it requires very complex computing machinery, which is in our brains. But it's easy to imagine, show that we can explain this by physical laws because we've built such systems and we know that they are completely physical. We've been doing this for centuries, but we've gotten really good at it since the middle of the 20th century. We construct what we call cybernetic systems, which are fully physical. And we know that because we've built them, we see every single part of it. And yet we see how they work in a very special way to be sensitive to teleological reasons. Common examples: thermostats, steam engine governors, wind turbine blades. And here I'm referring to the fact that they often turn a little bit when the wind gets stronger so that they don't get pushed over, but retain the same velocity of turning and pick up the same amount of energy from the wind rather than damage the turbine blades. A guided missile is another example. Okay, so all of these have some kind of built-in goal. I want to keep the temperature at 70 degrees. I don't want the steam engine to explode, keep the pressure within a given range, and so forth. And how they do this is rather clever. They use feedback loops, generally negative feedback loops, so that when the variable they're detecting is too far in one direction, then they make some modification in the system that moves it back towards the median. That's the goal. If it moves too far in the other direction, again, you have a negative feedback loop pushing back towards the middle. That keeps the system on track. Now, these are very simple devices. Often they are just tracking one or two variables, but we can easily extend this to more complex systems. And one way to do this is to have nested feedback loops. You have a second, third, or fourth order or higher feedback loops that control the operation of lower feedback loops. So maybe you've got several different subsystems that are feedback loops, and the higher order system selects on various occasions which one to implement, like a subroutine in computer programming. Or it might reprogram a given lower order subroutine that says, I'm going to change your reference goal to a different level. Okay, maybe there's a higher order system, for example, governing the thermostat, like a human being, that says, I want to save money. So that I want to keep the temperature comfortable, but I want to save money too. So when it gets really cold, I'm going to set the thermostat down to 66 and wear a sweater. So then we modify the goal of the lower level system so that it serves the higher order goal of the whole system. Okay, skipping another slide again. And I'm going to skip that too. Okay, so now contra-causal freedoms address this a little bit more directly. I've argued, partly on slides I've covered, partly on ones I had to skip because we're going to run out of time, that if free will is considered identical with the conjunction of contra-causal and responsibility and teleological freedom, then free will is impossible because it's not compatible with itself. It's inconsistent, let alone it's not compatible with determinism. But since it is so contradictory, perhaps this confused conjunction is not exactly what we all meant all along by this long used term. And remember again that almost everyone agrees that responsibility and teleological freedom are more important than contra-causal freedom. So maybe the only reason we thought contra-causal freedom was important is to get the other two. And once we're lifted from the illusion that we require contra-causal freedom to get those, we'll just drop it and say, yeah, that was never really that important, never what I meant. A word here about intuitions. It's often assumed that our pre-theoretical intuitions are incompatibilist ones, and that compatibilism only rises from some later argument. But a 15-year-old study of around 200 persons found that when they're presented with a sort of toy example of, here's this world of deterministic people, and everything happens in this world all deterministically. Whether or not you believe this is true of our world, imagine a world where this is the case. Now, in this world, the people do various things. Some of them are moral, some of them are immoral, harmful, hurtful, etc. And the questioners are asked, are the people in this world responsible for what they do? Do they act freely? And 75 to 80%, depending upon the question and the scenario, people said, yes, those people in the scenario are acting freely and are responsible for their choices. This suggests that when push comes to shove, free will is more often, though not always, associated with responsibility and teleological freedom, again, by the man on the street. Although, note that there is a minority of dissenters. About a quarter of the people thought that no, if there's no contra-causal freedom, then they're not really free. Does that show their pre-theoretical intuition support that, or does it just show they're confused by philosophy and theology? I'll leave that question for another day. But there seems to be some support here for the compatibilist position that our intuitions are not necessarily bound up with contra-causal freedom. Want to briefly note that maybe one intuition or feeling we have that supports contra-causal freedom is the idea that we are unpredictable. We cannot fully be predicted by others, and there's actually several reasons for thinking that that's true, but is irrelevant. We can get unpredictability of various sorts without contra-causal freedom. Unfortunately, I lack time to go into this slide, but if you want to come back to the questions, we can do that. There's also confusion people also have about the capacity to choose, the capacity to choose otherwise. Like when I was choosing chocolate, did I have the capacity to choose vanilla? And again, there's disagreement between compatibilists and incompatibilists about whether we have these capacities and what they mean. Gonna have to skip it. We can come back to it if that's really important to someone. Now, I'm going to finally end with Immanuel Kant's objection. A famous German philosopher lived over 200 years ago. While they weren't using the same terminology that we are today, there was a kind of compatibilism being promoted at that time. I think it was by Gottfried Leibniz. And Immanuel Kant responded to it, and he didn't like it at all. He said to call it being free simply because its principles of action are internal to it is a, quote, wretched subterfuge. And then he had a longer quote explaining this, saying if the freedom of the will that is the freedom we have, was only psychological, and that is driven by representations of means and ends, as I've suggested it is, and not also transcendental, that is independent from empirical nature, from the realm of cause and effect that we see in the world. Then, continuing his quote, it would at bottom be nothing better than the freedom of the turnspit, which once it is wound up, also accomplishes its movements by itself. And since most of us think we are better than turnspits, then we think, yeah, that I guess that compatibilist freedom isn't such a great freedom to have. I say, don't diss the turnspit. We can turn this example around and show that it actually supports the compatibilist notion of free will. So here are some turnspits. The one on the left is manual, and we've all doubtless seen things like this. You've got two vertical cast iron rods, and they suspend a further horizontal rod on which you put some turkey or whatever else you want to cook in the middle, and you've got a handle for turning it. Okay, pretty straightforward. The one on the right, these have been around for thousands of years, I'm sure. The one on the right is a little more complicated. This was a kind of turnspit that was developed in the 18th century. Kant would have been quite familiar with this type of machine. This is what he was referring to, winding it up. Okay, so on the left side, you'll see again the turkey or whatever being roasted in the fire. But more importantly, look at the other stuff on the right, because this is where the interesting stuff comes in. You've got a wheel, you've got a chain, then you've got a whole bunch of gears. And then if you look carefully, you'll see on the top of that gearbox, there's a rope running up. And what you can see is there's two pulleys on the ceiling connecting to the lead weights on the right. Okay, so those lead weights are gradually pulling down the rope that turns the gears, and that causes a somewhat more rapid motion in the chain, ultimately turning the turkey. And it's set up so that you could put those lead weights and have them run for, I don't know, 20 minutes, an hour, however long you like. If you need to, you could reset the chain, reset the weights, lifting them up. So you might need a little human intervention, but basically it runs by itself once you've wound it up the right way, once you set the weights on there. It performs the same function, but without the human intervention. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and we're not yet question and answer, so just think to yourself as I ask this. What is the most important part? If you had to identify a single most important part of, and we'll start with the left side turnspit, what makes it work? You might be tempted to think, well, it's clearly that handle because it needs to turn, or it's the whole horizontal rod that keeps the turkey up at the right distance and so forth. I'm going to suggest to you the most crucial factor in that whole manual turnspit are those two little U-shaped notches on the top of the vertical posts, okay? Notice what they do. They allow you to lift the horizontal handle up entirely if you need to remove it for cleaning or whatever, but otherwise they keep it at a level pace. It keeps it the right distance from the fire. And if you move the handle a little bit too far to the right, too far to the left, it's okay. It's gonna stay at that level. Compare this to, say, anyone, I'm sure all of you at some point have been on a Minnesota campfire trying to roast a marshmallow, holding a stick at exactly the right distance from the fire, turning it slowly so that it gets evenly browned. Is this difficult or is it easy? You all know it's difficult, very tricky for your hand unaided to get it exactly the right way. Those U-shaped notches prevent you from doing it wrong. They take your otherwise erratic, difficult to constrain motion, and they constrain it in just the right way to satisfy the goal. The gearbox on the right does the same thing in a much more complicated way, but it has these constraints that take what would otherwise be the unpredictable or far too rapid fall of the lead weights to spin the turkey round, and they turn it into a very slow, gradual, measurable, even cooking. So what this suggests is that when we act for reasons, teleological reasons, we are not free in the sense of freeing ourselves from the causal chain of events. We are constraining the causal chain of events so that it does exactly what we want and not all these other things it would otherwise do. Okay? The turnspit works by taking erratic motion and forcing it through a narrow channel to exemplify a specific pattern that serves our needs. Now I'm going to generalize. That's true of all useful work humans do on the environment. When we build a dam, channel a river, dig up coal and make it burn, not wherever it wants to, wherever it could, but just in a fire that turns a kettle on, that boils water, and it forces through just that pipe, not some other place it would like to go. All of these ways are just channeling energy forces into the paths we want them to go into. We're using causal laws, but we're constricting the way that it works so that it only serves our purposes and not some whole bunch of random things it could do. This came vividly apparent to me when I was pushing a rock from one side of a garden to another a few years ago in my Minnesota home. We had a big rock for aesthetic reasons. We wanted it on the other side of the yard, but it was very irregular. It was so heavy, I couldn't pick it up and just lift it to the place I wanted it to be. I could push it along the ground, one little push rotation at a time, but because it was shaped irregularly, I would push it forward and then sometimes it would veer a little bit to the left, sometimes a little bit to the right. So I was wasting a lot of energy because it was taking more time, it was traveling more distance than it needed to get to its destination. If I had been able to put it in the wheelbarrow so that only the wheel was interacting with the ground, or think of this, if I was able to put some hard clay around it, bake it around there, and turn it into a cylinder, I would have made the whole thing heavier, but it would have been far easier to push. So the problem is not the weight. The problem is its irregular shape, which leads to an irregular and erratic response to being pushed. If I could constrain it so that when I pushed it, it moved exactly where I wanted it to, I could have accomplished my task more easily. So what does this say our freedom is? Our teleological freedom is not free from physical laws of causation. What we are free from is the usual random, unpatterned behavioral response exemplified by most physical objects as they react to forces. By reshaping those responses to relevant patterns and reshaping the parts of the world we make into our tools, we are free to satisfy our ends, which would never happen, or it would be extraordinarily unlikely to result if we just let the universe do what it's going to do in this random, unpatterned way. Well, not only do we constrain tools and devices, we constrain our minds. Our neurons in our brains are extraordinarily complicated. They can make quadrillions of connections in all kinds of ways every second. In order to satisfy certain ends, we have to constrain our brains. We may not realize we're doing it, but we are. We're constraining them to go down just one path or a limited number of paths and say, do this one thing that satisfies my end, like figure out in the current situation what would be the highest thing that would lead to the highest probability of satisfying my ends. And think only about that for a few minutes until I get the answer, and then you do that thing, and then we satisfy our goals. So we have to constrain our brains. Our brains, in a way, are the first tool we need to constrain and restrict and channel down a narrow number of paths so that it doesn't do all these other things it could be doing and just does the one thing or the few things that help our goals. So what we call free will is really a constraint, but it's such a useful constraint that we don't mind it. We don't even notice that it's a constraint because it gets the job done. And let me briefly note that there's other ways we use the word freedom. And thinking back to the Turnspit, mathematicians and engineers talk about an entity's capacity to move in some ways, but not others. It's degrees of freedom, okay? The Turnspit has a restricted degree of freedom, but it's exactly that restriction that allows it to get the job done. Some incompatibles insist that free can only mean contra-causal, but if you look at other uses like this of the term freedom, that's simply not true. We use the word free in all kinds of other ways. If I say my steering column has too much freedom of motion or too much play in it, we don't say, hey, it's not contra-causally free, you must be confused. No, we all understand what it means is that it's moving too much in ways that do not satisfy our goals. Likewise, if I say it has play in it, we understand. I don't mean that I think it's having fun. Okay, this is just another meaning of the word. So when people say I have free will, and what they really mean is I can constrain myself to pursue my ends, I don't think they're confused. I don't think they're misusing the word free. They're not talking about contra-causal freedom. They're talking about a different kind of freedom. So In conclusion, what do I say about compatibilism versus incompatibilism? Which one am I? Am I one or the other? The answer is yes. In other words, they're both right. Both of them are correct about the substantive points. At least, again, the hard determinists, the libertarians, they're out to lunch. We won't. I'm not agreeing with them. But in terms of their terminological points, which one has the better idea about what freedom means when the ordinary person says it? I think the compatibilists have a little bit better case there. But again, there's room for dispute. And if someone wants to prove to me through other surveys that other people generally mean contra-causal freedom when they say I have free will, well, okay, we can talk about that. But again, remember, it's a terminological point. It's not an argument about how the universe works. The hard determinists and the compatibilists agree about that. And maybe we should rename what we call terminological freedom. Maybe instead of calling it free will, we should call it guidance, control, or self-governance, or something else. I'm open to that possibility. I do want to suggest, however, that what most people have meant for centuries by free will is more closely associated with teleological freedom than with contra-causal freedom, and it's only associated with the latter by a philosophical mistake, perhaps one that's very easy to make, but one we should stop making. That's my presentation, and now I'll open for questions.
Yes, so there are some in the chat, and
okay, so
we can, I don't see the thing where you can raise hands, but because I have your, I think it'd be better for us to keep your presentation on the thing. So I put one in there. It's about, you probably already know this one, about the studies that show people actually aren't aware of their choices consciously when they start acting on them. So they start acting on them first, and then they start thinking, oh, okay. And so I just put in the a couple of references to that. So how would that fit with what you just said?
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I think it actually works better.
Yeah, and this was started by I think a guy named Libet, something like that, a few decades ago. And this, of course, is completely compatible with the compatibilist view of free will. That everything we take as to be our sort of transcendental, non-cause-free choices actually caused by things in the brain that are going on before we are aware of them. Now, here is where I laugh a little bit, because a year ago I made an early version of this presentation, and somebody asked me a question, and I started talking about consciousness, and then we went down a rabbit hole, and then I realized, oh my God, huge mistake. This has nothing to do with consciousness. I think consciousness sometimes is useful. And deliberation. This is sometimes useful when we act as teleological agents, but a great deal of what we do is non-conscious. And what we do as agents, I don't even mean hiccuping. I mean making a decision, moral decision, instrumental decision. When I pick up the umbrella, it's rare that I actually deliberate consciously about, should I use the umbrella or should I get the raincoat? I mean, sometimes I do, but sometimes I just grab the umbrella. It's just obvious. It's just a habit. And if that's caused by things prior to my conscious awareness, yeah, that's how we work. So agency does not require consciousness. Indeed, it requires a great deal of unconscious thing. I don't think it would be possible for an agent to be fully conscious of all their decisions. And we could debate about God, but I think even there I've got a case to be made. But I can fully accept everything done in that area.
So Daryl Linden-Smith has a question in chat for you as well.
Yeah, let's see. So this is okay. This is a quote from The Astonishing Hypothesis: The Search for the Soul. Okay, so this is basically a knockdown or view of the reductionist compatibilist view, describing it. Your joys and sorrows, etc., are no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So do we have a soul, or do we even have joys and memories and so forth that are more interesting in any sense than what the nerve cells and molecules are doing? Okay, well, we can talk about what we mean by soul another day. That's even more contentious than free will. So I won't address that directly. But are our joys and sorrows sort of unreal because they are no more than, okay, and this is an interesting bit of the quote here, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells. Okay. The best address I've seen of this, although there's many who have addressed it, is by Sean Carroll in some of his recent books. I forget which one he talks most about this, but I think you'll have to look up his name. He's got several recent books, but he talks about something he calls poetic naturalism. And I love the term because it encapsulates what the idea is very well, that we can have naturalism, we can have physicalism, we can have, yeah, the world is ultimately particles and nerve cells and all these things bouncing around, but you've got these higher order things made out of it. Okay, and these higher order things, yes, they are patterns, and in some sense, they are nothing but patterns of the lower order things, but they are patterns, and patterns are real. And I've never understood anyone who says, hey, if my consciousness or my sorrows, or for that matter, the United States of America, or love, or whatever, is just a pattern of some other things going on, then it doesn't really exist. Of course it exists. Patterns exist. Patterns are real. Patterns are among the most important things in the world. Indeed, they are far more important in many ways than the things they are patterns of, because they could be patterns of anything. They could be patterns of atoms or molecules. They could be patterns of this or that. But the pattern, as a pattern, is extremely interesting. So I don't see why it would be a concern to say that they are no more than patterns of these other things. I mean, of course, a chair is nothing more than a pattern of wood molecules. My computer is nothing more than a pattern of various other constituents, but it's doing really interesting things, and not because it's made out of plastic or copper or silicon. It's doing interesting things because of what I see on the screen. That's what we're interested in, is the patterns. They're very real. If you want to call one of those patterns a soul, I have no objection. But again, we can talk about the soul another day in greater detail. Certainly we have a self. And I guess that's the final question, not the soul, but the self. Do we have a self? Yes, of course we have a self. The self is a very extraordinarily complex pattern that can engage in teleological activity. It's real. Patterns are real. They exist.
So as I said, I can't see everyone on this. If you have a question, you can put it in chat, or you can just say it, because there are only 17 of us, so it's okay. So I see that Tyler Waltz has a question for you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just put in the chat, I was asking about, where does freedom of will come in? An agency, basically, where does freedom of will come in affecting that person's agency when you have psychological phenomenon such as the bystander effect, or other psychological phenomenon that are influenced by others being present?
Okay. Well, I had a brief note at the beginning that I'm not going to address questions of, like, for example, political or economic freedom, where there are external factors that can constrict our choices. They certainly do, but the question I was addressing is, does the mere fact of physical determinism, if it is a fact, keep us from being unfree? There's no doubt that there are many other things that keep us from being as free as we would like. That is, free to pursue our goals, free to have teleological agency. And no doubt there are psychological ones, sociological factors that also restrict our freedom, where you know, we are persons with higher order brains. We are also fairly well evolved, but evolved chimpanzees, or a branch of the chimpanzee family. And we've got instincts, we've got social instincts, we've got go along with the crowd instincts. And do these prevent us from engaging in some of the higher order activity that we would otherwise like to do, so that after the fact we regret our inaction in a certain case, or regret our going along with the crowd, and gosh, why did I do that? Why did I join everybody else on that? Well, yes, those can restrict our freedom. Lots of things can restrict our freedom, but it doesn't mean that they completely make us unfree. For one thing, we've got the capacity to self-analyze. And again, that's a higher order activity. There we've got some of those higher order feedback loops I'm talking about. When we look at our activity, and psychologists can analyze it further and point it out to us more exactly and say, hey, look, did you notice that you were following that bystander effect? Did you notice you were just going on with the crowd? And sometimes we go, oh, yeah, you're right, I was. Let me try to do better next time. And maybe we do better, maybe we don't. But the mere fact that we can become aware of that is a testimony to those higher order feedback loops where we can at least potentially change our behavior. We can't become perfect, but we can move a little bit better towards improving ourselves. But I think, again, we do it using these feedback loops where we say, you know, that behavior I was exemplifying before doesn't satisfy my goals as well as some alternative behavior would have. Let me change my lower order routines so that they work better.
Are there other questions? Let me just see. So you could do it in chat, or you could do it just either unmute yourself, and that's fine because I can see everybody. If not, I will take the advantage of situation. So I'm sure you know one of the problems that Aristotle talks about with virtues. So virtuous behavior is a habit that one forms. And so the question is always, are you actually being a good person if you're just acting out of habit? And so you mentioned some of this with the response to Tyler. Could you get a little more fine grained? Because what you're talking about the free will, but somebody else might say, well, even that is determined. So how we're going to structure this, which virtues we acquire, all of this is part of outside influences determining our patterns of behavior to such a degree that when we choose to narrow, that was determined for us.
Okay, well, of course, someone who's disposed to compatibilism like myself will say, yeah, of course we're determined. So saying it's also determined doesn't really cause a problem, because we say, yeah, it is all determined. And in fact, I think there's great merit in what Aristotle says about habits, that if you have this habit, then you are virtuous. How you got it, that's a whole nother story. It doesn't really matter that much. If you were gifted to it through your natural dispositions, if you were trained into it, if you consciously set about making yourself virtuous, as long as you're virtuous in the end, that's good. He had a real point there. Now, what I would add is that if you just, well, okay, some people might say, what if you were just mechanically virtuous? You were programmed to be virtuous. You couldn't help but to be virtuous. Okay, well, that gets back to the question that I skipped over quickly about what it means to have a capacity to do something and how it is that these higher order feedback mechanisms work in our brain to get us to, or keep us in these habits that are indeed, let us hope, virtuous. I think if you're not ever conscious of what you're doing, able to choose amongst them, able to say, you know, I could be non-virtuous at this moment, but I'm going to stay virtuous, then you wouldn't truly be virtuous. You wouldn't have what Aristotle himself calls a virtuous habit, because you wouldn't be aware of what you're doing. But at a deeper level, I'd also even say that's not even possible. Some philosophers talk about zombies who do everything that agents do, but they aren't conscious. And I go with Dennett here, Daniel Dennett, who says, you know, there's no such thing. If you really spelled out what it meant for a being to act exactly like an agent, it couldn't not be conscious, at least sometimes. It couldn't have some awareness of making choices, okay? But that's completely compatible with it being deterministic. That at least is the first analysis. Let me stop there and see if you want to press this further.
Well, I was thinking more along the lines of artificial intelligence. So what they do is they keep getting many, many examples. And if they're programmed correctly, or they're programmed, they are better and better at narrowing, at reducing the different things. But we don't want to say that artificial intelligence is actually conscious, do we?
No, but again, you can be an agent, or at least you can do a lot of things that are agential without being conscious. I mean, carrots are very minimal agents. I wouldn't really call them agents, but they're sort of incipient agents. They do some complicated things. Amoebas more so, maybe. Snails, not a whole lot of consciousness there, but they have more agency. Squirrels have more agency yet. Are they conscious? Well, sort of, a little bit. We can argue about that another day in detail. Are babies conscious? Incipiently, barely, sort of is, I think, the correct answer if you're looking for yes or no. And ultimately, I'd say the same thing with artificial intelligence as we develop it further. I doubt we can coherently say that we have artificial intelligence that is currently conscious, but at a certain point as we develop it, I'm again in the Daniel Dennett camp that says if you really take it further to a level that is comparable to human agency, it will be conscious. And it's being made out of silicon is no barrier to its being conscious than our brains being made out of neuronic goo is a barrier to our being conscious. As Dennett puts it, clearly I love Dennett on most things. He says, is there anything least likely to be the source of or the base of consciousness than this goo that we have in our heads? But here it is. It turns out, once again, it's the pattern that matters, not the substance that it's made out of. So if we make comparable functional behavior to arise out of artificial intelligence, whatever it's made out of, copper, silicon, etc., it would be conscious. It could not help but be conscious because that's part of what it is to have. I think a large part, and I see Joel is with us. He's a psychologist, maybe knows a little bit more, but I've heard psychologists talk about a global access space. I'm using the wrong term here slightly. A space where you can have representations, beliefs, and values and so forth that are accessible to large parts of the agent, different subroutines, different functions, different brain mechanisms accessing the same, a global workspace, that's the term. This is a large part, if not all, of what consciousness is just to have a set of beliefs and memories and dispositions that are accessible from a large number of parts of our otherwise unconscious routines, but they share this data. That's what it is to be conscious. There is nothing else. And so it's nothing magic. But I'm getting a little bit into areas beyond my expertise. Again, we're talking a little bit about consciousness. And I can talk about agency all day without talking about consciousness. So I'm more interested in showing that we can be agents. Artificial intelligence can be agents. Whether they're conscious, psychologists can talk more about that than I can.
So Joel, go ahead.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking more about development and how, I don't know, I can't really form a question out of this, but it's just brought to mind the development of synapses in the brain, how we start out with so many more, and then it gets narrowed and we lose a bunch of connections in that period from 1 to 3 years old. And that just seemed like it was a parallel to what you're saying about needing those constraints in order to have the freedom.
Excellent point. It dovetails exactly with what I was saying, that the infant brain is more free in terms of being able to do anything in terms of its neurons. But that's what we want. we want the constraint. We couldn't grow up. We couldn't become conscious ultimately and do the things we do, the miraculous things we do as agents, without constraining our brains to learn, oh, this thing doesn't work, that thing doesn't work. Oh, but these things do. Let's keep doing more of those. And then it gets further refined, and it takes a few years. And yeah, very good point.
Did you want to add anything more, Joel?
No, I mean, I do. I'm more think along the lines of application. And so just thinking about parenting also, and how parents need to lay down constraints for their children in order for their children to develop. And, ultimately their children will lose their freedom if they don't have any constraints, because they're going to be thrown in jail, so.
Well, their constraints are in there in jail.
True too.
That's a very deterministic.
And this reminds me of something I said early on. I said, philosophical determinism is not the same thing at all as political libertarianism, philosophical and political libertarianism. But they do have a little bit of connection. You sometimes hear libertarians, political libertarians, say, oh my God, we need absolute freedom. Any government constraint is bad. It limits our freedom. And I say, for God's sake, no, it doesn't. There are lots of government constraints on our action that make me more free. If there weren't traffic laws, I would not be free to cross the street in front of my house. Okay, I need constraints on other people, including myself, in order to have the freedom to satisfy my goal of crossing the street safely. And the same is true for a million other things. The thing about that, you know, parents need to constrain their children, just as governments sometimes need to constrain people to give them the things that they really want. You know, it reminds me of something I'm fond of saying about paternalism. You know, libertarians are always saying, oh, paternalism, government paternalism is so bad. And I say, paternalism is just fine when you're dealing with children or people who are acting like children. And there's lots of them, as we've seen.
Well, we've got another thing in the chat, but it is 1 o'clock, so I know some folks are busy. And I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Scott for giving a very interesting talk on free will and determinism that I'll have to be thinking a little bit more about. But so if you need to go, you can go. But why don't we look at this, what Daryl has put in there. Daryl, do you want to, is he actually with us? Yeah, he is. Do you want to say this, or do you want Scott to just read it?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm in a coffee shop, so I thought maybe it'd be better to type. But yeah, my basic final question is, epistemologically, what can we truly know if there's a degree of determinism that constrains our adaptive response to environment and so on? In other words, aren't we living in an illusion in some sense that circumvents our ability to empirically test the world?
Okay, so I actually see two things in your question. And is this from Sam Harris? You say Harris at the beginning of the quote? I presume it is, because
yes, that quote is.
Yeah, he does say things like that. Yeah, so there's actually two things. He's talking about responsibility, and then he qualifies it as deep responsibility. Okay, so that's one thing. We can talk about moral or other kinds of responsibility. And then secondly, this question of epistemology. And I think there are two somewhat separate questions, though they might interact somehow. One of the slides I skipped over was distinguishing responsibility from what, again, some libertarians or other incompatibles call ultimate responsibility. And maybe that's what Harris means by deep responsibility, meaning uncaused responsibility, responsible for what we do and responsible for everything that caused what we do and everything that caused that and so forth. And again, the incompatibles say nothing is, at least nothing outside of God, I wouldn't make that exception, is responsible in that deep self-caused way, at least in a deterministic universe. So either we aren't so responsible or we live in a non-deterministic universe. Okay. I think this talk about deep or ultimate responsibility is just a silly word game. We can be responsible for something without being deeply responsible for it. And again, I could just point back to Aristotle's idea of habits, or many other philosophers who've talked about ethical virtues or dispositions, and point out that you know, if you are caused to be a certain complex personal agent with various dispositions in the world, and you use those dispositions to harm people, you did that. Yeah, something else might also have some responsibility too. If some mad scientist programmed you to be that way, they're responsible too. But you're still the one doing it. Just because A causes B causes C doesn't mean that only A caused B. B also caused C. That's the whole point of the supposition, is that these intermediate things and especially the most immediate causal link in the chain did in fact cause that later thing as well. So if you are a complex being capable of making moral judgments and acting on them, and your dispositions are such that you make defective moral judgments, well, yeah, that's a defect in your moral character. Or if you make correct moral judgments, but you act against them anyway, again, defect in your moral behavior or your moral judgment and how it interacts with your behavior. We can call that a defect without saying that you have to be deeply responsible or a self-caused causer. That has nothing to do with it. Okay, now that's one issue. Then there's the epistemic issue of how can we know, or how can we even be reasonably confident that any of our beliefs are true? Okay, now this is a much more complicated issue that really deserves an evolutionist psychologist to talk more about, but here's a few things I can say. There's a great deal of evidence that our evolutionary history has programmed us to very often search for the truth, but here's what I would say, not just to detect the truth, because we often don't detect the truth very well, but to search for it and to be able to critically analyze it once we think we've got a truth, but we want to make sure. And this, once again, goes to higher order loops. We evolved not just with this immediate ability to perceive the truth instantly and see it as real. In fact, we know perfectly well that we often make mistakes. There are perceptual illusions. There are all kinds of other illusions we have. Sometimes we misperceive other people's emotions and the effects of our actions and so forth and so on. Okay. How do we know this? We know this because we figured it out. How do we figure it out? Because we have higher order loops in our brain that look back upon our behavior and go, is that really going on? And why does there seem to be this puzzle between the judgment I've reached over here and what I'm observing over here? Let's investigate this further. So we appeal to a yet higher, or we just invent a higher, because we can construct new higher order elements in this hierarchy of teleological goals and say, hey, this thing I used to call truth, it doesn't seem to work over here. What's truth over here is incompatible with what I perceive as truth over here. Let me seek out a deeper truth by trying to reconcile these. Maybe I'll do an experiment. Maybe I'll come up with a different theory that subtly re-explains what I thought was the truth here and the truth over here, so then they can come together. That's how we can detect that when we perceive an illusion, it is an illusion. It's not real. The stick in the water is not actually bent. It just looks bent. The color illusions that we see on the internet, that dress that was blue or gold, or that square on the tile that looks black, but the same colored tile looks white on another part of it where it's shaded, but where it's not shaded, I guess, by the cylinder. You all know what I'm talking about, this cylinder illusion on the checkerboard. Oh, yeah. And then we look at it again and go, oh, okay, my eyes were deceiving myself. But it's because we search deeper, because we're trying to we are often enough trying to unify our beliefs, our understanding, our theory of the world. And that often requires taking what we used to think was true and modifying and saying, well, it looked like it was true, or it's true that it looked that way. It's not true that it really is that way. And maybe we need to even redefine what we mean by is or looks. It turns out, in fact, when you really look at colors, for example, there's no such thing as red simpliciter. You can't even identify it with a certain wavelength of light, because what looks red in one environment looks not red in a different environment, depending upon its context, depending upon how you're looking at it, and so forth. But that doesn't mean reality is just in the mind. It's all in the mind, as they said. No, it means that there's more to reality than we initially perceive, but we're able to perceive more of it or come up with better theories of it by sort of triangulating, cross-referencing, cross-checking these different anomalous perceptions or beliefs or theories that were partly explanatory of one thing, and then it turns out there's a deeper truth. Of course, one of the best and time-tested examples of this is Newtonian physics. It looks like it's true when you're dealing with things moving slowly, much more slowly than the speed of light and near the surface of the earth and so forth. But there are these anomalies. You look deeper and you go, oh, okay, that was only an approximation to a deeper truth, which is Einsteinian physics. And that too may be only an approximation to something deeper yet. And we keep going. So what we, to answer your question now in short, it's not that we have an ability to immediately perceive the truth. If your point is, oh, if we can't immediately perceive the truth, then we don't know what's true or not, what's not. Well, you're just wrong, okay? It's true we don't have that immediate sense. We don't need it. Maybe it would be nice, but that's just not how our brains work. What we have is the capacity to seek unifying principles underlying apparent anomalies. And by using them, we invent science and we come to deeper truths, and we're still not done, but let's keep going.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Scott again for a really good presentation and engagement with our audience. If any of you are interested in presenting at Science Religion Lunch, we're the NPI is kind of booked this year. We have about 20 events in one semester, which is a lot. But we're looking for folks in fall, and hopefully we can do a hybrid in which we're together again, and also this so that folks like Scott can join us from Hawaii. So thank you. It's a beautiful day outside. I hope people take advantage, because apparently we're going to get something tomorrow that's not going to be so nice. So bye, and we'll see you all later.